Ellie. Welcome to everyone online. Before I start on Judges, I want to go back to, I had a very long lesson last time also, and I didn't finish one thing that was relevant that I thought was important, and to provide some continuity that I want to talk about this. I want to go back to this. This is Joshua now. I taught Joshua 1 through 16, 1 through 12, 6 through 12, 6 through 12. And I had this slide in my deck, but we didn't get to it. Obviously, the major theological theme in the book of Joshua, not Judges that we're studying, Joshua, is the covenant. The central element of the covenant is the promise of the Holy Spirit, the promise of the Holy Land, rather. As such, the book repeatedly emphasizes the Lord's faithfulness in fulfilling promise. Israel was a covenant nation and thus required to keep the covenant. So I thought of Exodus 19 to 24, that passage there. That was, if you do this, I'll do this. If you keep my commandments, if you worship me, if you follow me. So it was a conditional covenant. As enshrined in the covenant provisions, any deviation was punishable, yet this was a means to protect. Got a little text box here on top of the, oh, shoot.
Divine promise.
It's not on the screen, but I have to be able to get rid of that click share, Elizabeth. Let me help you. Pause the report. Pause the report. I know. Control Alt Delete.
Look, we want to quit.
No, you can't quit it.
Yeah.
Here you go.
Just, pretend it's not there.
You can't make that go away.
Bad experience. Right.
There you go. Thank you. Reminds me of the cartoon where this will happen to Loretta and I this evening. Children and grandchildren arrive at your home, and the grandparents say, "Oh, good, you're here. Here's my iPhone. Will you fix it?" To the 6-year-old, right? As enshrined in the covenant provisions, any deviation was punishable. Yet this was a means to protect the divine promise. And now the clicker doesn't work. Pause the recording, Elizabeth. Come over here and help me. What we did didn't solve the problem because I can't advance the slides and I can't use the clicker. While the young person fixes that. Now my iPad's going to sleep. Well, this is not my day.
I did offer to help you.
Yes, you did, Si. And I eschewed your offer. So I'm going to read the next slide from my iPad. Is it working?
That was what
Was Charles. Oh, okay, good. So here we are. We're going to talk. In the book of Joshua, the covenant was renewed with the people of Israel 3 times. The first time was when they crossed the Jordan, built that altar on the other shore of the Jordan River, and they worshiped God, renewed the covenant. The second time is this story right here, and it's just 5 verses. And here's what it says. Then Joshua built an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, on Mount Ebal. He followed the commands that Moses, the Lord's servant, had written in the book of instruction. Make me an altar from stones that are uncut and have not been shaped with iron tools. And in Deuteronomy 27, it says, then built an altar to the Lord using natural uncut stones. So this is what Moses told them. This is the actual experience that you got on the screen there. Build the altar of uncut stones and use it to offer burnt offerings to the Lord. Also sacrifice peace offerings on it and celebrate by feasting there before the Lord. And this was to happen at Mount Ebal. So they built the altar. And Joshua, then verse 34, Joshua then read to them the blessings and the curses Moses had written in the book of instruction. Every word, look at verse 35, every word, every command that Moses had ever given was read to the entire assembly. Does that mean the Pentateuch? Well, can't. I don't know what it is. Is it just this passage from Deuteronomy? But in the upper left corner, you can see Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, with the city of Shechem in between. Here's an aerial photograph that I found on Google Images. I don't know how new it is. The only point to make is that this was a natural amphitheater. See how the two mountains are bowed there? And it's a mile from the peak of one to a mile of the peak of the other. And apparently Joshua stood somewhere there on one of those mountains. First of all, they erected the altar on Mount Ebal, curses. And they read whatever it was they read in this natural amphitheater. Here's another view of it from this is a grainy picture, but this is from Google Images. It's not that far apart, a mile from crest to crest. And so they read the curse, the blessings and the curses. If you will do these things, if you will keep my commandments, if you'll keep the covenant, then I will make you fruitful and multiply, and your herds will have lots of offspring, and your crops will be great, and your enemies will be subdued if you do this. And the book of Judges is, they didn't get it. That's the problem, right? So now let's go to the book of Judges. And I got an outline here. This is where I'm going to spend the bulk of the time, because I think this is the most interesting part of Judges, the introduction. Chapters 1 to 3, verse 6. And then the second part of the book is about the careers of major and minor prophets, judges. And notice like 2a, Shamgar. One verse in the whole book of Judges talks about Shamgar, but she was a judge. The four judges rather, is Deborah, Barak, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson, have the most written about them. And that's, if we get time, we'll talk about a couple of those judges, but we may not. So here's a question for you. Why study the book of Judges?
Good question.
When I was a freshman medical student, I took a class, and I've told you before, from Dr. Graham Maxwell, who had more influence on my spiritual growth and maturity probably than any other human being on earth. Graham had a wonderful way of talking about God. And the class I took as a freshman was called the 66 Books of the Bible. And in the midst of taking gross anatomy and histology and 3 or 4 other classes, this religion class, which was supposed to be kind of a sleeper for medical students, had to read the whole Bible. I think it was in a year, not a semester. And every time we claimed to read us not, was it a year or a semester? It was a year. That makes more sense. 66 books of the Bible, and every time we came to class, Graham's question was, what lesson do we learn about God from this book of the Bible? And he often said, and I've heard in recordings on on YouTube and stuff, Graham, the book of Judges is one of the most difficult in the Bible. Now, Kelly alluded to that last week when he said, I'm glad Lauren's teaching next week, not me. There are a lot of difficult stories in here. We probably will touch on a few, but I kind of want to stay up at the 10,000 foot level. Up here. Judges 1. Let's move on to Judges 1. Oh, I wanted, 2 texts came to mind when I thought about why study Judges. You can just float off and say, that's a difficult book, a lot of ugly stories in there. Let's just not do it. But what did God, the Apostle Paul, through inspiration, say about the Bible? In Timothy 2, verse 3, chapter 3, verse 16 and 17, he said what? All scripture is profitable for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness. And in Romans 5:14, he said, Paul, for everything that was written in former times was written for our instruction. These difficult passages we're going to study were written for our instruction, so that through endurance and through encouragement of the scriptures, we may have hope. So when you read Judges this week, Did you have hope? Good. Some heads nodding. Good. I did too. That's what we want to talk about. Bob Diffenbaugh is a pastor and a theologian that I find he writes a lot of sermons on Bibles in the Bible. And this is his comment about a sermon series. When we come to the book of Judges, we come to a book of the Bible that really does need an introduction. In other words, why study this book? I find that Christians in general tend to avoid the book. When others heard that my next sermon series would be on the book of Judges, the response I received from each one has been remarkably similar. Similarly put, they looked puzzled and asked, why study the book of Judges? That's the question we just posed. Things to know about the judges. Were the judges really judges? Did they sit and settle disputes? Well, really military leaders, right? Military leaders. Stay coordinated with my iPad here. While Joshua dealt with Israel as a nation acting in unity, so Moses and Joshua, as leaders of Israel, dealt with the whole nation of Israel. But after Joshua passed, they kind of fell into this territorial tribes were preeminent. It kind of reminded me of colonial America. That there were 13 colonies and they all had a governor, and then they finally said, you know, we need to come together and get rid of the British. And they did, and they won the Revolutionary War and elected a president. But that's kind of what I think of when, as I was studying this week, that judges during this time was like 12 states governed by tribal leaders. There was no central leader after Joshua died. One commentary I read said this: every book of the Bible makes a unique contribution to the scriptures so that the story would not be complete without any one of the books in the Bible. The unique contribution of Judges is that it describes the period in Israel's history when it had no strong central leader, before it was led by kings. And what's that phrase that we read over and over again in Judges? In those days, Israel had no king. Each man did what he considered to be right. Right. Let's go on to the background. At the time of the Judges was a period comparable to the Dark Ages in church history. All people did as they pleased according to their own subjective standards. We just read that text. This period extended from the time and death of the elders, the tribal leaders, and Joshua, who had seen the great miracles God had done for his people. Judges 2:7 says the people served the Lord throughout the time of Joshua and the elders. So this time extended to the time of the prophet Samuel. Now, the Andrews Study Bible commentary from whence this came pegs that at approximately 300 years. Other commentaries I read said it could be as much as 450 years. So when we jump from story to story in Judges, we got to think, well, the next week they deserted the Lord, and then they had to bring Deborah and Barak and Jephthah and Gideon. Well, this was 400 years. It could have been 40, 50, 60 years between these judges. And so as we read Judges, we need to interpret it in that context. It wasn't like they forgot God the next week, although some of them probably did. The book of Judges describes, I'm going to read this stuff and then we're going to have a lot of discussion. The book of Judges describes the interaction between God and his people after they entered the land of Canaan. A new chapter in the history of the nation was being written, and what we find is disturbing. We move from some element of social order, Joshua was leading them, to almost total chaos. At the center of the book is the covenant relation that God established with the 12 tribes that would have ensured safety and security. The book is about the covenant, God of the covenant, the destruction of the covenant, the relationship of the covenant, and the results of its destruction, or when they fell away from God. The book of Judges reveals a God full of compassion and mercy towards sinners. Whenever they cried out to the Lord. He heard them and sent a deliverer, a judge, as a sign of his grace. In other words, what Israel experienced was not the uncontrollable power of the enemies, but the response of a loving God seeking to preserve his covenant relationship. You see, that covenant theme just goes on. And so, introduction to the Judges. Chapter 1 of Judges. The multiple commentators that I read said Judges 1 and Judges 2 are two separate introductions to the book of Judges. In the same way that I was the one that taught the lesson on Genesis 1 and 2 when we started the Old Testament. I remember Genesis 1 is considered one introduction or one account of the creation narrative, and Genesis 2 a different account. In much the same way, that's how this reads if you think about it. So let me just read a few selected verses from Judges 1. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, notice they asked the Lord, who of us is to go up and fight against the Canaanites? Joshua's gone. And they asked the Lord, who should go up and fight? And the Lord answered, Judah should go up. I have given the land into their hand. And then skipping to the end of the chapter, the Benjamites, however, did not drive out the Jebusites. There's ites everywhere in this book. Hittites, Midianites, did not drive out the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. To this day, the Jebusites live there with the Benjamites. That would be whoever wrote this book, Samuel, for example. And in the case of Manasseh, they did not drive out the people. Manasseh was one of the two sons of Joseph, remember? And their surrounding settlements, for the Canaanites were determined to live in that land. When Israel became strong, they didn't exterminate the Canaanites. They pressed the Canaanites into forced labor. Never, this is the Bible narrative, I'm not reading from a commentator, but never drove them out completely. And therein is the crux of the problem, right? It's kind of the narrative of Judges. How would you describe the if they had persisted in this line of action described in verses 1 and 2? What kind of government would that be? How would you describe that form of government? It would be a what? Theocracy. God's intention was to rule them. If they just said, okay, Midianites have risen up, Lord, what would you like us to do? And he said, go over there and do this and that. And God could have led them as he did. So immediately after Joshua dies, this is their first encounter with the people living in the land of Canaan. And they asked the Lord's advice, and he said, do this, and they had success. And instead of persisting in that path of success, they said, this was easy. Let's do it on our own from now. It reminds me of the lesson I taught 2 weeks ago. Great victory at Jericho. Ai's a knockover. We'll go up their butt. And they got theirs handed to them. In Deuteronomy 7 is the first time I think that God gave this instruction. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you're about to enter and occupy, he will clear away all the ites. There's a list of them. When the Lord your God has given these nations over to you and you conquer them, you must completely destroy them. This is God talking through Moses. You must, we talked, both Kelly and I talked about this. Make no treaties with them and absolutely do not intermarry with them. This was in Deuteronomy 7, God talking to Moses. Or the anger of the Lord will burn against you and he will quickly destroy you. Then moving forward into chapter 2, and I'm going to read we're going to go through all of Judges 2 because I think it's the key passage. We'll ignore much of the rest of it. But I do want to read this together. The angel of the Lord went up. Stay caught up over here. The angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochum and said, I brought you out of Egypt and led you into the land I swore to give to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. If you do this, I will consistently 100% of the time do that. But But you got to break down their altars and destroy them in verse two, last half of verse 2. Yet you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this? Interesting question. Isn't it? Yet you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this? And I also said, I will not drive them out before you. They will be. And I also said, I would not drive them out before you. They will become traps for you, and their gods will become snares to you. I finished saying that to them. What was the reaction of the people? Sadness, crying, remorse. If you turn away from him and think, this is back in Joshua 23, and cling to the customs of the survivors of these nations remaining among you, and if you intermarry with them, then know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive them out. Instead, they will be a snare to you, a whip for your backs, and a thorny bramble in your eye. In other words, a stick in your eye. And you will vanish from the good land the Lord has given you. He will also bring disaster on you if you disobey him. This is Joshua speaking on behalf of the Lord. He will completely destroy you from this good land he has given you. If you break the covenant of the Lord your God by worshiping and serving other gods, his anger will burn against you and you will quickly vanish. Good land he's given you. I wasn't keeping up, was I? I did. After Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, gave that speech that I just read, they went to take possession of the land, each to their own inheritance. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and the elders, that would be the tribal leaders of the 12 tribes, who outlived him and had seen all the great things the Lord had done, crossing of the Jordan, fall of Jericho, etc. Joshua, son of Nun, servant of the Lord, died at the ripe age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance. After the whole generation had been gathered, let me go read it off the screen, the font's bigger. After that, the whole generation who had been gathered to their ancestors, in other words, the generation I just described that witnessed the crossing of the Jordan, the fall of Jericho, etc. Another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what had been done for Israel. So once again, took 40 years for a generation to die off in the desert. This is 40, 50, 60 years later. You think it's like boom, 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 these stories, but there's lots of time. Why do you think that they had no knowledge of the Lord and what he had done? Right.
Well, I think it's a great question because God instructed Moses to teach him the song. He taught him the song. The song said exactly what was going to happen to him so that they would remember all the things God had done and what the covenant was going to call for in punishment, and they were going to do it and be punished. All of that was in the song.
Yeah,
And the purpose of the song was to keep it alive for all the future generations.
exactly. And yet, Barbara.
Well, they also were supposed to teach this to their children,
Exactly.
and they obviously didn't.
With no books then, so it would be oral tradition, but they didn't teach their children. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, their ancestors who brought them out of Egypt, worshiped various gods. They aroused the Lord's anger. Verse 13, because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreth. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies, all around whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. So, if you do this, I will bless you. If you don't do this, this is what's going to happen. And it happened exactly as God had foretold. Why do you think, well, when you say the Lord's anger was aroused, he forsook them, his anger burned against them, he allowed them to be plundered and sold. Why did God have that response? Please, Todd.
I think the anger is being attributed to God, but I think God is letting them have the consequences of the actions that they have chosen. I mean, they chose to follow the balls and the Ashtoreths. They made that choice. This is the natural consequence of what's going to happen. I warned you what the consequences were going to be, but you did it anyway. And I'm going to let you have the consequences of the choices that you made.
I agree with that. And that is, in my mind, that is the explanation that Brett will get you a second. In Hosea chapter 11, the prophet Hosea, God said to the children of Israel, how can I give you up? How can I let you up? It wasn't God's plan for things to end up like this, but he allowed the natural consequences of their rejecting his leadership and his covenant to fall on the pregnant.
This is one of the concepts, the Old Testament, but particularly this part of the Old Testament, that I have the most difficulty with, because the concept is that God knows the future. And if you believe that, then he knows when he's doing all of these things, including making the covenant and renewing it 3 times, even though it had been broken over and over again before the next renewal. When you picture it from God's standpoint, and he knows the future, so he knows when he makes the covenant, it's going to be broken and broken and broken. And therefore, the other side of the covenant is he's going to be punishing these people for breaking it. And there's God saying, okay, look, I'm looking down, it's time for another punishment. I gave you free will. Maybe I hoped that you wouldn't do it this way because you have free will, but I know, because I know the future, exactly that you will. And my hope would be misplaced in a sense, right? So he's punishing his people. So I get down to this section and it says, and his anger burned.
Mhm.
If I was God, the feeling I would have would be, gee whiz, I gave you free will. Man, did I hope you would be able to do this. I'm sad that it didn't work out that way. Not burning when I actually know the future. Why would it be burning? I knew this was going to happen.
That's a really good question.
Okay, so one of my favorite
I'm not going
parts
to.
in this whole passage was Judges 10, and it's from 10 to 16, where the people get in trouble again and they cry out to the Lord and said, save us. And the Lord replied, when all these peoples attacked you, did I not save you from their hands? He's very human. I mean, we're in his image, so why not? But you have forsaken me and served other gods, so I will no longer save you. Go out and cry to the gods who you have chosen. Let them save you when you have trouble. And the Israelites said to the Lord, please, please, please. And God, it says here, and God could bear Israel's misery no longer. The fact is that he is a generous, gracious, loving, forgiving. And this was what I took away from it, because, we do that too.
Mhm.
I mean, we're the Laodicean church, according to Revelation. We are lukewarm, and God says, I'm so disgusted, I want to spew you out of my mouth. So we don't have a whole lot on them.
Oh.
And yet here's God saying, I can't bear your misery anymore. I'm going to help you.
All right. You can have a piece of, you can have a cookie. Okay.
I feel like that's because God loves us. Because of his love, he knows as we face those consequences, we'll go back to him, because that's his end goal.
Right.
That he can renew that covenant and we can have that relationship again. It's in the midst of that trial, that consequence, that we can find him again. So he will have that overall.
Is there an audience beyond the earthly audience for this story? What you're Brian?
No, I was gonna say, as I look at this, my faith always has me look at, I think that word that's been translated to anger, there's something missing there, because the God we know, that doesn't strike me. Frustration, yes. Disappointment. And I think of it like a parent with a child. The kid says, let me help you pour some orange juice. I want to do it myself. Okay, you step back and there's a mess in the kitchen that's got to be cleaned up. You know, I want to ride the bicycle. I can do it myself. Okay. You step back and skin knees and broken wrists, whatever. But it's not like the parent picks the bicycle out from under the child and knocks it over. They step back and they let the motor take its course. And, you know, when the child cries, they come back. I see it as that same relationship. You know, there's frustration. This could be easier if you'd let me help you for a bit.
I used to say to my children when they were growing up, choices have what? Choices have consequences. Free to make that choice. You had your hand up, sir. I don't.
I think this gentleman had first.
All right. I forgot your first name.
Joe.
Go. That's
So
right.
the introduction of Baal worship, was that a remnant of the people they conquered, but yet did not follow the instruction of?
Right.
Completely destroyed.
Correct. And that was their plague forever. Go ahead.
I think my point is just to reinforce what her brother here mentioned. It's a presumption, I believe, of us trying to understand what does it mean, the anger of God. I think the point is exactly that since he's the creator of the laws of the universe, if something happens because of my choice, he's allowing that to happen because it's his law.
Right.
But he doesn't want this to happen. So the understanding is very profound, and I think sometimes we're afraid of encountering that. But the thing is clear. He's the omnipotent. Everything is under his control. He's letting it happen. Joe's stories is actually an answer to that.
Yes. Yeah. Good
And
point.
what we need is to be under his wings.
Right. Good. You had a comment?
Yeah,
Your first name again.
Darian.
Darian.
When I hear this, I think about our God, jealous God, first and
Mhm.
foremost. We know that, we've seen it.
Mhm.
I also believe that the Lord can be angry. He went into his temple and he saw people trading and selling and doing all of this stuff. We saw his anger. So we know that the Lord is himself, right? He is complete. So yes, he can experience anger. I think when we look at this and we see that, you know, his children that he has selected and picked when, you know, all of the nations were divided and, you know, God says, you know what? I pick Israel and this is his special vessel. This is his special clay masterpiece that he's done. And then they go serve some fallen angels and they go doing this and doing that after he has invested the time. He has shown that he has forgiven. He's done all of the things that he can do. And they still go, using this parent analogy, across the street to some devil worshipers. Yeah, that parent's going to be upset. That parent's going to be angry. That parent is going to say, hey, you know what? I got to discipline you.
Exactly.
You wanted to go across the street and they fed you some crap. Well, you got to eat that crap. When that child is like, Dad, I don't want to eat it anymore. Then that heart gets softened. And we see this even with Jesus. When the woman says, hey, even the dogs get the scraps. Okay, you know what? I hear you. I had this judgment. This was my answer. But because of your faith and because of your belief in me and because of your pulling and calling out for me, I will hear you and I'll answer. And that's what he did.
Nicely put. Comment over here.
Yeah, that was me, but I 100% agree with what he was
You
saying.
took your point.
That is exactly.
All right. Anyone else? Before we move on? Martha.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to understand because when you look at the New Testament, you see Jesus saying, love your enemies, do good to them that persecute you, earn the other cheek, and so on. And you look at the Old Testament, you see what appears to be sanction for violence. Okay. It's very, very difficult to understand. So you begin to try to figure it out. And I think in a way, it's kind of an impossibility. So I fall back on what God says to Job. You know, your thoughts are not my thoughts. Neither your ways, my ways. Right? So, you know, our imagination, there's an Oscar Wilde quote. He says, imagination was given to man to compensate him for what he did. And a sense of humor console him for what he is. So I find myself.
Say it again, one more time. Everybody.
Imagination was given to man to compensate him for what he is not, and a sense of humor to console him for what he is.
After a while.
For a while. So I find myself in a position of saying, laughing at myself. Because that's what we have to do. Because as he says, your thoughts are not my thoughts, neither your ways are my ways.
Hmm.
I have to put my trust in God.
Amen.
So that is what it means. And when you think about it, violence, right? Imagine at the cross, the violence. Yeah, the violence to the Creator himself. You know, then you begin to understand that he himself was subjected to intense violence.
And what works for me is what Graham taught me when we went through the 66 books of the Bible. Quote from Hebrews 11, Hosea 11. How can I give you up? How can I let you go? But if you're determined, this is Hosea, but if you're determined to do these things, my anger is letting you go. Reap the consequences of the choices you make. Oh, hands everywhere. Okay, Jack.
I just have to hang on to the idea that while all this carnage is going on, that some of the people that died, some of the babies and children that died were not part of. In other words, sometimes the whole country can be led by its leader and go sideways, but not every single person in that crowd had given up on God. That's the way I hope it is.
Yeah, I have a quote from Illinois that speaks to that. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Remembering the second point I had. So, we kind of have to remember, where does anger come from? Most anger, especially between a parent and a child, the source of that anger is from experience, not so much anger at said child. So, for instance, in God's case here, yes, he has that foreknowledge, and like a parent, you have that foreknowledge. I'm not a parent. I'm the youngest.
Sit next to one, right?
Yes, but let me say it this way. Let's say if my dad,
Use your words wisely, son.
let's say I asked to go to a party with some friends. Now he's older and wiser, and he understands exactly what might happen at said party. He doesn't want me to go, but I'm old enough that he can't necessarily stop. So I go. Not so good things happen. He's going to be upset, obviously. And that makes sense. That's where that anger would come from. But that anger does not remain because there is the other aspect of his nature, which is love. And the anger is not so much at me, but at the result that has happened to me. You see, because if he was
the consequence of my choice.
If he was angry so much at me, then I can't come back home. You're done. The anger is at what has happened. See, I'm sorry for you, son. Look what happened. Listen to me. That wouldn't have happened. Yeah.
Good points. Good points. That's
Like to hear the because I'm with her. I think about, I don't want to jump ahead, but I think about Ruth, who's in the night, and she it makes you wonder what other women that got killed might have been converted or not, and the children and even the animals. So I would like to hear that quote
Okay.
referred to.
Well, let's keep going. What did I want to make here? This is just continuing. So the Lord raised up judges who saved them, yet they would not listen to their judges and prostituted themselves to other gods and worshiped them. They turned from the ways of their ancestors who had been obedient to the Lord's command. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. Remember, this is long periods of time here. This isn't weeks between these stories. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to the ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors. How's that possible? Even more corrupt. They were doing child sacrificing and everything. They refused to give up the evil practices and stubborn ways. Therefore, the Lord was angry with Israel because this nation has violated the covenant I ordained for their ancestors and has not listened to me, I will know this. Barbara, is this the passage you were talking
The
about?
line was 10, but it's.
And yeah, I'm coming to it if we have time. The time is racing. I will no longer drive them out before them, any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them, the remaining Canaanite nations. I will use them to test Israel and see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their ancestors did. The Lord has allowed those nations to remain. He did not drive them out at once by giving them into the hands of Joshua. That give you more pause, Breck?
Yeah.
Same
Because what's
stuff.
a test for a person that knows the end?
So I asked the question a minute ago, and there were lots of heads nodding. Was there another audience besides God and the people of Israel? Yeah. Judges 3. These are the nations the Lord left to test them. There was a whole list of ites. They were left to test the Israelites to see whether they would obey the Lord's command. And they lived among the ites. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to the sons and served their gods. So it was really bad. That is the introduction, the end of the introduction to Judges, right? The middle of chapter 3. That's the introduction. Now, so here's some discussion questions. Let's see if I want to do any of these. Hey, Loran, any of these that grab you, you can raise your hand and answer too. If not, we'll move on.
What do you mean when you say was there an audience? Who's the other?
The beings in the universe.
Yes.
Where did that come from? That came from Ellen White, right? Who said she visited in a trance.
Comes from Job also. When
Job, I was thinking of Job.
Too. And others, that's
Lord
it's not Satan represented the earth.
Right.
That's not the only person he was in Job.
And Job talks about the heavenly council that came together from other universes into God's heavenly. Go read it, Job 1 and 2.
Yep.
You don't agree with me? Let's discuss that over lunch. Let's discuss that over lunch. One more.
So I know we touched on it a little, but that question that said, what motivated their disobedience? I think that's something we can learn today as we raising children. I mean, you said 60 years. I don't understand why these parents did not tell them, feed their faith. What motivated that question in the middle? What motivated their disobedience on 2, the last part of 2?
Yeah.
I mean, I would like to hear what
do you think about that? How might the Israelites have justified their failure to drive out the Canaanites? I remember I read a little while ago that they prospered for a period of time and they got stronger. And instead of carrying out God's command and destroying the Canaanites, they did what to them?
I think a lot of times when you start
Enslaved them.
Yeah. Right. A lot of times when you start depending on yourself when things are going right, kind of, right? And also I was thinking, you can tell your children a lot of things and give them information, but then they're looking at you. How are you living? What are you doing? So a lot of times if that's not happening, you could tell them so I'm thinking they were not living, faithfully the way God expected. So telling the kids this, what happened.
And telling them one thing and doing another.
Exactly, and that's today.
Right.
And that's.
Carlene and then Derek.
I think of the text, by beholding, we become changed. And it was all about who they were beholding to, and their relationships with who they were beholding instead of him. And I think that's true with our children as well.
Brian.
Is it any difference between the have no other gods before me, which is a command we have, and yet we allow other things in our lives? We've been told if your eye sends you, cut it out. Things you see, things you read, if your hand, things you do. And yet we let all that in to come between us and the Lord. He's told us to drive those out of our lives. Much like he told them, and they, for whatever reasons, ignored it. Same reasons we do today.
One commentator talking about Judges said people that don't you go to a conservative church and ask them, why did you not study Judges? They would say, well, there's too much sex and violence in Judges. And yet they go home from church and watch movies on their TV on Netflix of sex and violence. So Joe.
I think there's a disparity in how God deals with people.
Okay.
Doesn't appear to be equal. If you know of these things and do them and keep them, you know, you get
Stuff happens.
standards and one set of conditions and rewards and whatever. And the heathen that do nothing are kind of looked at a little differently. So do we treat people unequally as well?
Are you suggesting there was a double standard here?
Yeah, we have, I think we as human beings have a double standard, even how we deal with each other. I mean,
We perceive some people as lesser than.
I didn't hear you.
We perceive some people, our time, as being lesser than, and therefore we treat them differently.
Yeah, if you have a need or involved in a conversation or dealings with an educated person or a person of position, you deal differently than you would with that homeless guy that's asking for $1. You know, we don't have that equality in our dealings with people either, and
You're right.
God.
You're absolutely right. And you're suggesting that God, in the same way, had an inequality. He had this chosen group of people, but what was his ultimate desire for that group of people?
Which,
That they would, through the following of his covenant and through the success that they had, they would witness to the nations. They were right there in Palestine, right at the crossroads between Europe and Africa and Asia. Right there at the crossroads could have been a group of people who would witness for God, and they just blew it up top.
Was him and go, but I think his idea is he was gonna set it up so that he could
Witness.
others about him. I think that the testing piece that there in Judges 3 is like, well, you guys aren't quite ready for this yet, but let's start. You know, that's gonna be tough because they were gonna set up and be like the royal priesthood, to use the New Testament language, to minister to others. So they were unequal in the sense that, you know, God chose them first, but then he wanted them to spread, not go the direction they ended up going.
What we have on the screen now is the first verses of Judges after the introduction. Judges 3:7. It's the first verse, and let's just read these 3 verses. The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. They forgot about the Lord their God. They served the images of the Baal and the Asherah poles. I had pictures, but time's running out. Then the Lord burned with anger against Israel. There it is again, and he turned them over to, and the ... there's a whole list of ites there. Verse 9, but when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, he raised up a rescuer or judge to save them. And here's the quote from Ellen White. Yet God did not completely forsake his people. There was always a remnant. Who have mentioned that over here? Jackie, maybe. There was always a remnant who were true to Jehovah, and from time to time the Lord brought up faithful and courageous men to put down idolatry and deliver the Israelites from their enemies. But when the deliverer died and the people were released from his authority, they would gradually drift back into idol worship. This was the reason for Israel's story of backsliding and correction, of confession and deliverance, and repeating itself over and over again. That doesn't answer your dilemma, but Barbara.
So I think we need to be, when it comes to feeling sorry for these people because of their ignorance, in Romans 1:18-24, you know, it says that talking about godless, wicked people, what may be known about God is plain to them. God has made it plain to them. Since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so men are without excuse. And then, you know, so yeah, so you know, according to this, and the Israelites were treated differently because God had to have a path for the Messiah to come, and he chose this nation and made a covenant with them. And I always felt, you know, a little confused at when Moses talked in Deuteronomy, and he said, oh, if you follow God, you're not going to get sick. You're not going to have any enemies. You're going to prosper. Your farms will all do well. Yeah, I mean, it was heaven on earth what he was depicting. But we are fallen people with fallen human natures, and we don't want to just accept good from God's hand. We want to do things our way. And I guess that, I mean, we're that way right now. We are. So I guess that explains it.
Nicely done. So God's anger is, okay, if that's the choice you make, then I'll let you suffer the consequences. That's his anger to me, Breck.
What I find striking about what the previous slide is that it ends with the comment of like what Terry always talks about, the circle, backsliding. Right?
We get there when we go through the kings, good king, bad king, good king, bad king.
It's the big thing. It says the same thing. Okay.
Exactly.
Israel were with you, God, and then you backslide. Well, the way I see it is there's probably not a lot of difference between that and our experience. I pray all the time and I do things to say, why on earth did I do things? So they would backslide and come back. We actually do it in our lives, but there's this huge difference. The difference is we are living after the new covenant. They lived in the old covenant.
Good point.
We believe and still backslide, and we're covered by grace. We have a totally different experience with God from that. They backslide and get punished under the old covenant. It's odd. I don't really understand why that is, and I don't really understand why God had the covenant knowing it could never be performed, had in his back pocket the plan of redemption, and we have the benefit in our experience of the plan of redemption.
We do. Got minutes left.
You wonder how good they were, because Deborah, right, in her song, talks about 2 women for every man. And then the way they
shortage of guys, huh?
women, that where's the 10 Commandments there? Stealing women, having 2 wives, committing adultery.
This is why Judges is such a difficult book. We didn't talk about a single judge. I had enough. We could go another hour from what I had in this lesson, but I want to land the plane because you all get off the concluding thoughts. This is again from Robert Diffenbaugh. When I see God's faithfulness to his promises and his people in Judges, I'm encouraged because it assures me that God will fulfill his purposes and promises to me, current day us, even when I fall short of what God desires for me. I am encouraged that God uses men and women who were not perfect and men and women who had flaws. In the end, this is what I like. In the end, it's not our faithfulness on which we can. Endurance grows because our confidence in God grows as we are reminded of his deeds in history. And continuing on, we live in dark and uncertain days, today. Days very much like those depicted in the Judges. Several of you have referenced that. We are no better, really no different than the Israelites of old. Though times may be dark and difficult, we are assured through Judges that God is faithful, and thus he keeps his promises. And encouragement from biblical history and from the message of the book of Judges. So the book of Judges continues the theme of Joshua, which is the covenant, the centrality of the covenant, and how they failed and failed over and over again. But we are assured through Judges that God is faithful and thus keeps his promises. Now, I talk about Graham Maxwell, all the time, but the other author has had a huge impact on my spiritual journey is Morris Venden. And this was the very first book that Morris Venden ever wrote in the mid to late 1960s. If you go into Kindle library and type in "It's Who You Know," you can purchase this. It's a scan, it's an ebook, it's a scanned version because it hadn't been out of print for decades. And this is the quote from that. You know how Kelly always has that quote at the end? What are the 4 things that God knows? This is my new one. I'm not gonna show it that often, but this is my new one, right? It's who you know. And Lee Venden down there in the lower right corner is the nephew of Morris Venden. And Derek Morris is our former pastor here at our church, who's the editor of Ministry Magazine. And he interviewed Lee Venden and published an article in February of 2012. You can find it on just Google searching it. And I love this quote. Kelly asked me about it last week, and I'm going to use it again, and then we'll save it for another occasion. Christianity is not about what you do, but who you know. And who you know will change what you do. Amen. All right. Have a wonderful Sabbath afternoon. Enjoy the beautiful fall weather. Winter weather for Florida.